Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this seminar. My name is Juhani Knuuti. I'm just a very newly elected president of the Finnish Academy of Science and Letters. I actually started 3 weeks ago. This is the first event I'm now chairing, welcoming you here. We are now having this very interesting, hopefully stimulating discussion about these turbulent times. This is the program. I'm not going to do it much about details because the next speaker will focus on that. I'll just give a few words about this academy, where we are now. So this is a society which have been trying to promote science and the scientific impact on society for almost 120 years now. And this is originally a Finnish-speaking society. Of course, we are bilingual anyway. So the goals of the society are to promote excellence, enhance collaboration between the different disciplines, influence the policymakers. That's a very important role of ours in the future, even more important. And of course, the focus on the societal challenges. If you look at our focus areas, we have very much topics which are perfectly matching the seminar topics of today. We're talking about the freedom of and continuity of the science, impact of science on the society, and then of course focusing on the major societal challenges. So I'm very look forward to have hearing this discussion today and learn about. My background is medicine, so it's always very nice to hear something outside of my own field. It's very refreshing. I can recommend that to you. So that was my short opening words, and I welcome the next speaker to explain a little bit more about the program, and I hope you enjoy this seminar. Thank you.
I have a paper here. Dear friends, my name is Jørgen Sejersted, and I serve as chair of the board of the Holberg Prize. I would like to express our sincere gratitude to the Finnish Academy of Science and Letters and to its president, Professor Juhani Knuuti, for so kindly welcoming us here in Helsinki. It's really nice, it's really interesting to be here in the Academy and in this wonderful city. In 2003, the Norwegian government established 2 international scientific prizes in fields that were not covered by the Nobel Prizes. And that was the Abel Prize in mathematics and the Holberg Prize in the humanities, social sciences, law, and theology. And the Holberg Prize is named after the 18th century scholar and writer Ludvig Holberg, who was a central figure in Danish and Norwegian cultural and intellectual history. Parallel to the Holberg Prize, the Niels Klim Prize is awarded in the same ceremony in Bergen each June. And the Niels Klim Prize is named after the adventurous protagonist of Holberg's 1741 utopian novel, Nicolai Klimi iter subterraneum, The Journeys of Niels Klim Underground. And the prize is awarded to an early career scholar from or working in the Nordic countries within the humanities, social sciences, law, or theology. Beyond the prizes themselves, the Holberg organization also organizes the annual Holberg debate, and it administers the Holberg School program, which aims to foster interest in and understanding of research in the humanities, social sciences, law, and theology among upper secondary school students in Norway. So we have sort of 4 legs to stand. Both the Holberg Prize and the Niels Klim Prize are awarded by the board on the basis of recommendations from academic committees composed of distinguished international scholars in the relevant fields, some of whom are present here today. The Niels Klim Committee selects its candidates from nominations submitted by scholars and institutions in the Nordic countries. The most recent recipient of the Niels Klim Prize was Daniela Alatinolu, whom we are very pleased to have with us in today's panel. Thank you for coming, especially to you, Daniela. It's very nice to see you again. I say to you all that you should please check our website for further information and consider submitting a nomination for next year's prize. Tomorrow, the Nils Klim Committee will meet here in Helsinki to select the next laureate, which is the primary occasion for our visit here. I would like to take this opportunity to express the board's sincere appreciation to the members of the committee for their wonderful work, and to its chair, Professor Andreas Føllesdal of the University of Oslo. Thank you, Andreas, and to the whole of the committee. The Holberg Prize regularly co-organizes academic events in conjunction with committee meetings, and today we are really delighted to co-host this seminar here in Helsinki. The seminar features an excellent panel, which will shortly be introduced by Stefan. The theme of the seminar is Research Excellence in Turbulent Times, a theme that would surely have interested Ludwig Holberg himself, as he started his scientific career during the Great Nordic War at the beginning of the 18th century, and he later conducted his research as a professor of history during the absolutist rule of the pietist Danish king Christian VI. As I also see that some of the panelists will focus on gender aspects, I will mention that one of the most interesting aspects of Holberg's writing is how he carefully and covertly negotiated an 18th century queerness through careful allusions to classical authors such as Ovid, Petronius, and Plato. So he would be very interested, I think, in the discussion you're going to have. The moderator of this event is Stefan Nygård, Associate Professor of European History at the University of Helsinki and Project Manager at the Finnish Academy of Science and Letters. Stefan's recent work has focused on Scandinavian intellectual history and European North-South relations, power asymmetries, and entanglements in European cultural and political space. Stefan currently leads a project on the history of science in Finland and also conducts research on the neoliberalization of Nordic democracy and the history of bilateral cultural cooperation between Finland and Sweden. So, Stefan, please, I hand over the word to you.
Thank you, Jörgen, and very warm welcome to everyone also on my behalf. In this project that Jörgen mentioned on the history of science and knowledge in Finland, we are concerned with these topics that we will be discussing today, so it's very much about how science is also always embedded in society, of course, and vice versa. And we are looking into, of course, the different difficult and turbulent times in the past that science and scientists and scholars have had to survive. The first thing to note about this topic of academic freedom is, of course, that it's never a given. It's always a negotiation. We have these fragile academic spaces for the pursuit of truth that have been negotiated in relation to rulers and ideologies, publics and markets, and politics and so forth, through many long and very difficult struggles. And today we now find ourselves again in a time when these negotiations are being redefined in a dramatic way once again. I think that what makes this situation perhaps particularly painful for us that we may be leaving behind a period of perhaps rather brief, relatively stable science-society relations, and what is sometimes called a social contract that guaranteed us as scholars at least some degree of freedom to define, let's say, the rules and the norms and the values that govern our work. If there was such a contract and if it functioned rather well in the Nordic region, this achievement was certainly part of the broader success of what we call the Nordic welfare state, the specific social formation that, after all, was that upon which our reputation in the world rested ever since the 1930s. And maybe the Cold War had something to do with it as well, when Finland and Scandinavia were positioned at a crossroads between the geopolitical East and West, which was a frightening place to be, but also potentially fruitful and productive in terms of the political and intellectual bridge building potential that came with that position. If we then widen the perspective to incorporate global trends, we are today also witnessing an uncomfortable departure from a century of techno-industrial optimism to some extent, which rested on the strong belief in the power of science and technology to improve and radically alter our lives. So these are only some among the many simultaneously ongoing transitions that we have yet to manage. And we haven't even started talking about the predicament of poor Europe between the current power politics, neo-imperialisms and militarization, East and West. We will have a chance to return to some of these questions in the panel discussion. But first we will begin with three presentations by our invited guests, opening remarks. And it's my great pleasure to introduce now the first speaker, who is Daniela Alatinolu, who is Associate Professor of Law at the University of Turku here in southern Finland, and she is also the recipient of the Nils Klim Prize last year in 2025. So congratulations, Daniela. And she has an impressive career already, a very interdisciplinary one. She explores how societies and laws co-define each other and co-evolve, how groups mobilize to transform their positions, and the different ways in which the laws serve to both include and exclude. She is, among other things, author of a book called Grievance Formation, Rights and Remedies, Involuntary Sterilization and Castration in the Nordics, 1930s to 2020s. And she currently leads the ERC-funded project From the Margins to the Center, Rights Development, Transitional Justice and Indigeneity in the Nordics. And today, Daniela will share with us some reflections on intersectional feminism in these times of turmoil. So welcome, Daniela, the floor is now yours.
Thank you very much, Stefan. Thank you all. It's a pleasure to be here today. So the title, Stefan also mentioned, that I have for today is Intersectional Feminism in a Time of Turmoil. And I come at this topic as a human rights scholar, as a scholar that is interested in law and gender, and also increasingly in law and nationalism. So I will share with you some examples that I think are pressing in our current academic and world environment, but also drawing a bit on my own research. So what do I mean with intersectional feminism? This might not be a term that's very familiar to all of you, even though I'm sure some of you have heard of intersectionality before. So intersectionality was a term that was coined by an American legal scholar and lawyer called Kimberly Crenshaw. In that context, the end of the 80s, she was talking about how specifically Black women were facing a forms of oppression that were different from that faced by white women in comparison and Black men, and how the law did not really understand or conceptualize this kind of oppression. So since the end of the 80s, intersectionality, and that is also a theory that I have myself used and continue to use, has developed and also developed within legal scholarship. And I think that the law has, at least to some extent, also developed to understand different forms of oppression and different forms of discrimination, and also understanding that different forms of oppression can intersect. So racism can intersect with misogyny or sexism. And that power abuse and power relations are very much situated and contextual. and the law may not always really be able to grasp that. But we have had some recent judgments, for example, by supranational human rights courts that have started also to grasp the concept of intersectionality. So intersectionality, I think, is also a term that has been important within progressive movements. And we have been pushing also for sort of greater equality, greater inclusion. And now, in the face of the rise of the radical and far right, there is a lot of talk also within progressive movements of, well, should we really continue to push for further equality, or should we kind of take a step back and defend the rights that we have, at least in some contexts, already won, such as the access to safe and legal abortion, which is very much also a target of some far right and radical right movements. So what are the kind of threats that we are seeing today, especially within academia? Well, we see, first of all, the very material defunding and defunding campaigns. We see in some countries, I think Hungary is often mentioned, how gender studies especially is being shut down, defunded, even banned. Called bogus science. But we also see, for example, in the US under the Trump administration, how initiatives that involve DEI, so diversity, equality, inclusion, are being very much a target of defunding, and universities that have such programs are also becoming targeted. And I think that we often want to think about the Nordic countries as exceptional in this way, that we are egalitarian and we embrace equality and democracy and human rights. But I think we should not also think that the Nordic countries are very exceptional in or immune to these kinds of trends and movements that we are seeing. And I know myself that in Finland there has been increasing interest by some recent governments in research, what kind of research is being done with public funding. And also I've heard from Danish colleagues that similar trends or similar things are happening in that context. And these are just examples that I have happened to hear about and also experienced myself. In the age of social media, and when we are all partly, at least, online in our lives, we also see how scholars that are, especially those that are outspoken about racism, about sexism, for example, about gender or sexuality, are being increasingly targeted by hate campaigns. We are also quite easy to reach in many ways. Often our contact details are public to some extent. And we also know that especially women researchers and non-binary researchers receive much more hate mail and this kind of this type of oppression and attention in this age. In my own research, I have dealt partly with trans rights. And I have also seen how whenever I have spoken out about trans rights, that there is this kind of mobilization and negative attention and transphobia that we can also see not just on social media, but actually also in the actions and laws by government. So we see how legal gender recognition, from being embraced by more countries is now also being restricted in certain jurisdictions. We see how gender-affirming treatments are being very much a target of transphobic movements and the far right. And also the idea that gender is fluid is very much something that there is mobilization against, especially on the radical and far right movement. And we can also see within even feminist movements that there is a rise of trans-exclusive feminism, for example, and how this has also driven this kind of divisive, or it's acting very divisive, and we can see that transphobia is in this sense on the rise. So my final slide here is I wanted to also raise this point to the panel, the rest of the panel, about gender studies and sexuality studies. Why are these so sensitive disciplines? Why are they so targeted in these times especially? So sometimes I've heard the story that these disciplines, even within progressive movements, were not really taken seriously, and they're kind of weak and sort of an easy target in that sense. And I think that's definitely not the whole truth. I think that this is also because they are also being referred to, if you read, for example, the messages of the Trump administration, being called radical. And the fact that they are disciplines that scrutinize the organization of society, of the family, and of power imbalances in those structures is being perceived as very radical and something that's dangerous. But I think that there is also maybe some solace in this, or that it can be an empowering thought actually also for gender and sexuality scholars. But we can maybe come back to that. When it comes to academic freedom that we are also discussing here today, of course, it is important that there is public scholarship, that we continue to engage in discussion, not just in the ivory towers of academic institutions, but also with society at large. But when certain scholars are being targeted more than others, when there are some activists, such as racist activists, for example, coming to attend lectures, coming to appear with their physical presence, coming to ask questions about lecturers' and researchers' private life, then I think it's also important that we raise the question of institutional protection and how institutions do protect the scholars that are more vulnerable than others and tend to be the target of this kind of attention more so than others. Because all institutions, we might not really be equipped for this. And it's, of course, quite an uncomfortable discussion to have, because we like to think that that there are not this kind of, that we have democratic societies and egalitarian societies, and this doesn't necessarily happen in the Nordics. One final point that I would like to also raise and lift in this regard, that I think deserves more scholarly attention, is the emerging research that we are seeing. And I think that gender and sexuality scholars are very apt to do this kind of research and can take an active role in doing this kind of research on how ideas from the radical and far right are traveling to the mainstream and becoming mainstreamed. So not just talking about ideas on migration and limiting migration, but also, for example, the current discussions about population challenges, decreasing birth rates, that are often underpinned by these kind of concerns of what kind of babies do we want to be born? What kind of population do we want? What kind of migration do we want? Which I think, yes, are very important questions that deserve more attention. But I think I use my time, and I look forward to the other panelists' presentations as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Daniela. I'm sure many of you have questions, but I want to ask you to save them for a little later. We will have time for audience questions to each of the speakers at the end of the panel discussion after the opening remarks. And now I want to introduce the second speaker. She is Susanna Paasonen, Professor of Media Studies at the University of Turku. She has worked and published widely on sexuality, media and affect, with recent publications including titles such as Dependent, Distracted, Bored, Affective Formations in Networked Media, and another book on Yul Brynner, Formations in, Exoticism, Cosmopolitanism and Screen Masculinity, as well as a co-written book on Hot Connections, Why Sexual Platforms Matter, with Jenny Sundén and Katrin Tidenberg. Susanna Paasonen is also a member of the Nils Klim Committee and will talk this afternoon about the problem with sex. So please welcome Susanna.
Thank you, and thank you for having me. Actually, my presentation follows organically from Daniela's. It's like we planned it or something. It's during my postdoc and sort of mid-career, I had a project about 9 years that I was working towards what became a book about online porn, published in 2011. And basically, 9 years is a long time to spend on something, and by the time the book was out, it was still the first monograph to address the mainstream of online porn, and 2011, that's kind of late, which sort of tells that this area of research hasn't been perceived as particularly attractive, maybe in terms of career development. By the time the book was out, I really felt I had nothing new to say about the topic, and I was ready to move on to other things. But what I had also witnessed was actually the formation of a field of research, and this is something quite rare that you get to witness that. I've actually also witnessed the rise of internet research as a field, so too, that's not bad. And within this, the launch of the Taylor and Francis journal, Porn Studies, in 2014 was sort of a landmark thing, and I've been involved with it since the beginning. And what the journal has been doing, and the reason it was set up, was to fill these kind of severe knowledge gaps. Because in ways that we narrate media history, for example, history of culture, sexual media tends not to be part of the equation. So for example, we have this kind of a large-scale study on the history of Finnish print media that completely omits the sex press, which was massive for a couple of decades. Just a Finnish example. And also what's happened is this kind of broadening of inquiry into different fields of sexual media. But this has always been a contested field. And I've been sort of saying for years that it would have been very difficult for me to do this research in the way that I've been doing this research in many other contexts than Finland. And I think this is actually true. So the starting point has been easier. And while I've not always had institutional support, I've also had institutional support, even funding. So when the Journal of Porn Studies started, there was immediate pushback from other feminist scholars, because porn would be one of those topics where it's perceived that if you are not against it, then you are political, and you have political agenda. Whereas, for example, when it comes to production cultures, histories of porn use, what people understand with the term, there's very little research. More now than there was in 2014, but still knowledge gaps remain. And these are the founding editors of the journal, Fiona Atwood and Clarissa Smith. And it's interesting what becomes then perceived. So basic research, conducting basic research in a peer-reviewed journal becomes framed as political, a pro-porn agenda. And of course, the politics has always been uneasy in the sense of critical sexuality studies, which would be the broader field that this connects to. And with critical sexuality studies, there's kind of distinction from sexuality studies with a behaviorist edge that tends to be quite normative. It's more the critical inquiry of sexual cultures, also considerations of sexuality as a matter of rights. Also, I mean, well-being would be the connecting factor between different fields of sexuality research, but also an area of social power and regulation. Things haven't become particularly easier with what Daniela already mentioned, with US moves against diversity, equity and inclusion agendas, basically, which means if you would be applying for a Fulbright and you have controversial terms in your research profile, let alone in the application, such as women or gender or cultural heritage, you are woke and you really are not allowed to do that. You're allowed to do it, they just won't fund you at all. So, but when cultural heritage becomes a woke term, I think that's a bit of a red flag for humanities scholars at least. The Kinsey Institute, which has been a hub of sex research in the more behaviorist area, but also has a really important archives, was defunded by Indiana State already 4 years ago. It wasn't dismantled, so it's still part of University of Indiana, but it's not only Trump's second term where we are seeing this. This is a longer process of eroding kind of possibilities for conducting and infrastructures for doing certain kinds of research. So while examples like the recent Texas A&M University banning a philosophy professor from teaching Plato's Symposium because it deals with racism. And when a philosophy professor can't teach Plato, then what are you supposed to teach then? So these examples, they're kind of easy to take as this kind of proof of ridiculousness, but it's important really to see this broader agenda that Daniela was really pointing out here. This didn't come from thin air, and it's not going to go away anytime soon. But of course, in Finland, we do have the Non-Discrimination Act. So basically, and according to the Act, we should really advance social equality, and so good research should advance social equality, prevent discrimination on the basis of personal traits, including sexual orientation, religion, age, ability, what have you. So in that sense, good research should be woke. And we are in this interesting kind of area where certain things that should be taken for granted as areas of inquiry, such as cultural heritage, become framed as woke, and actually, according to Finnish legislation, banning that kind of is a bad thing to do. When conducting research, increasingly, I think in all universities in Finland, there's a push towards AI tools for more efficient research practices, and why not? But the problem when you're doing research on this field, for example, I asked a couple of chatbots, AI chatbots, ChatGPT and Microsoft Copilot, which is the data safe tool used by universities, for a book I'm doing about the most popular porn tube sites. They can't tell me because it's dirty business and they can't tell me. Elon Musk's Grok would tell me, but of course that's a different issue. And last spring I was assessing a PhD for Lyon, and I wanted to be sure, because my French is my fourth language, it's not that brilliant. I wanted to be sure I understood this film theoretical discussion on spectatorship. So I asked, again, Copilot as the data safe tool, to sort of translate things for me. And in very polite French, it explains like, no, I can't do this because this is obscene. It's sexually explicit. So this is about theories of spectatorship in the context of histories of pornographic film. But since these large language models operate through stop words. So certain words are a no-no, independent of context. They are completely context blind because, of course, it's not artificial intelligence. It's not intelligent. It's it's not. So there's no distinction between an academic PhD thesis and writing porn, basically. It's all the same. And this is annoying, I mean, for students who want to sort of check the language of their work, and if the work is in a certain area, they actually can't, which means that these tools that we pay for, that universities pay for, actually discriminate actively against certain fields of research, and this would be against the Finnish constitution guaranteeing academic freedom. And I think this is an actual issue because we are, I mean, in many ways, as Danieli pointed out, we are not isolated from the campaigns, the tactics of the radical right are being copied in different European contexts, also in attacks towards academics. But we are also part of this infrastructure for research that in ways that are not very subtle considers certain topics not just as woke. I think it does process women, like words like women, without much of a problem. But it really clearly discriminates against fields of research that traditionally haven't been particularly well supported to start with. Now, my concern here is in particular, it's about junior scholars, younger scholars in this environment where it's a real sense that the space for critical studies is being cut down and down. And I'm seeing people moving towards safer topics in their postdoc. And of course, it's good to be versatile. I'm not saying that. It's good not to be like a one-trick pony, just doing one thing. But I think this isn't just about being strategic about your careers. It's also trying to have a career in the job market where basically US is a no-go zone. And where in many European countries, the pushback towards doing this kind of research is very real. Now that's me. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Susanna. And again, I ask you to save your questions. We'll get back to this issue of censorship and self-censorship in its various manifestations in the panel discussion later. But first, we have one final opening remarks by Mariana Jauhola, who is Senior Research Fellow at the Tampere Peace Research Institute, and somehow peace has become a controversial issue suddenly, an adjunct professor in global development studies at the University of Helsinki. She's worked extensively on the politics of intersectional inequalities in post-disaster and post-conflict context and their entanglement with ethno-nationalist populism in South and Southeast Asia, using collaborative visual ethnography and life histories as your methodologies. So we see a pattern emerging between these three different talks. They are dangerous topics, testing our fixed identities and boundaries from different perspectives. And Mariana has published 3 monographs on these topics and several articles. So you are very welcome, and the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, and thank you for the invitation and being here today. As the title promises, I will provide you an account of, and you can treat it as a reflection of a primary investigator of several research projects the past 11 years, of global populist right wing and its impacts on research. More concretely, the focus is on my encounters with the populist right wing in Finland, but also that of Indonesia and India. And more specifically, what are the impacts of phenomena on the research conducted on global political economy and ecology from a feminist lens? All my past and ongoing research projects, which all are connected intimately, how right-wing populism, or as I call it, disaster populism, has specific interest in governing and controlling sexual politics and gender orders in situations of aftermaths of disasters. And my primary focus has been on Indian Ocean earthquake and the tsunami in 2004, Gujarat earthquake in 2001, and Biparjoy cyclone in 2024, affecting the region in South and Southeast Asia, sometimes locally, sometimes regionally, where I have located my research since 2005. Oh, so sorry. Okay, I think I broke it. For the purpose of our discussion today, I want to emphasize that disaster populism is both a context in which disaster recovery and questions of inequality rise in my research, analytically. However, it is also the context where I, as a researcher, and my collaborators, research participants, live and work and have livelihoods and uncertainties related to them embodied in the everyday interactions. So I'll give you a couple of examples. The research centered on a peace process that has been celebrated widely, in particular in Finland, as a successful one, mainly because it was facilitated and mediated in Finland by our former president Martti Ahtisaari and his peace mediation office CMI. And central to my research question in Aceh was the multiple forms and layers of inequalities of the brokered peace, challenging the simplistic understandings of success and notions of peace as an absence of violence. I mean, all this is now in history, you can imagine, between Indonesian army and the Aceh independent movement. I mean, we are in a total new era of peace, as suggested by moderator, but I talk about the old days, sort of. At the heart of the analysis was gendered forms of Islamic populism and narratives of future. However, this coincided in Europe, the 2015 so-called asylum-seeking crisis and the rise of right-wing inspired Islamophobia. And concretely, this would mean that we would get random attendees to our research-connected film screenings in Finland at events where such people would be observing and trying to figure out what was the positionality of the research project vis-à-vis asylum-seeking and migration policies. So it was this kind of lurking in the back row type of a thing, thinking like maybe this person doesn't belong to the audience somehow, and so on. So this interest to the project in Finland was actually a surprise to me. I was not prepared for it, because in my preparation for the research in Indonesia, I really had to navigate and understand the wider workings of right-wing ethno-nationalism and authoritarianism and populism, but in Indonesia. So I was not prepared to face it here. So for example, I'll give you an example from Indonesia. So I got to a situation such as a female mayor of Banda Aceh city who represented one Islamist populist party would use my visit to her office and feed stories to the local media how I was supporting her and her agenda for arresting young adult punk rockers playing in the streets, with whom I was collaborating with, because I was trying to understand how they negotiate the public space and resistance to this populism that she represented. Furthermore, it was also essential to conduct the research ethically and safely for my Achenese collaborators, but it also, not just the punk rockers, but also academic research community, because I would have to take care for example, how to form partnerships and thinking about public project narratives and engagements in public, always thinking about how to protect individuals who were interacting with racialized white researchers such as me. So for instance, with my collaborators from LGBTI community, we moved fairly quickly to our discussions at that time to safer space, such as Facebook, which in fact later became a source of vulnerability as the moral police started doing intelligence through the social media networks in order to arrest and charge them for practice of homosexuality. That was illegalized in the aftermath of that celebrated peace process. And similarly, the current research that focuses on value chains of commodity frontiers, which date palm producing small farmers in India with the date palm producing small farmers in India in the aftermath of the Biparjoy cyclone. And it's centered on another red flag, so one has to learn where the red flags are, as has been mentioned already earlier. In this case, it is the farmers and agriculture, coinciding several years of farmers' protests against the central government. In this process, it is essential to form such university collaborations where we identify the grey zones and areas that are sensitive and get used to the questioning of the immigration officials of my research purpose. So exactly a year ago, I was interrogated at 1 a.m. in the morning by the immigration officials of my research purpose and who my collaborators are, and why I have published so little recently. And could I explain them what ORCID is? So maybe actually you as organizers have actually made a mistake in inviting me to talk about research excellence, because clearly from the point of view of the immigration officials, I'm not publishing enough. Well, the book was in the production at that point, and of course I did not talk about that even when interrogated at 1 a.m. Such experiences sharpens the research praxis and helps keeping the main aim crystal clear. To do research that stays analytically tuned into the dynamics and the politics, setting longer-term goals than just saying yes to a media interview that wants sound bites for quick reporting. So I'm literally refusing to comment on the political affairs going on in India at the moment, because I do want to finish my research and have something to say about things, but a bit later. And so when my MA student in Global Development Studies 6 years ago finalized her thesis of a closed anti-migration Facebook group, I realized she's teaching me something important, which would be useful later. So she had analyzed emojis, GIF animations, and coded language that right-wing followers or advocates, wannabes, were using in order not to be censored and not to be prosecuted, due to their critical discussion on development aid, migration, and asylum seeking. So her thesis literally would teach me 3 years in advance how to read similar coded language from the attacks on the research project that got funding from the Research Council of Finland in 2023. So the context in short: during the autumn 2023, a ex-user, and let's just call him here Double M, published tweets in which he chose to critique, or as he calls his agenda to be, fight for the science, such funding decisions that had allocated budget for feminist and anti-racist research in Finland. Project would end up in his radar if the project titles or summaries would include words such as feminism, intersectionality, and anti-racism or migration. Now, the project EnviroCare, which I'm leading, got multiple hits, as we were promising to deliver feminist political ecology analysis and contribute to the field of feminist peace research. And during this first round of targeted campaigning, the tweets of Double M and his followers ridiculed the concepts and incomprehensive language used in our project synopsis. The same 30 or so projects were targeted 2 years later, last October, when the Finns Party-affiliated think tank published a pamphlet written by the Double M. However, this time he had become a party member and elected municipal council representative in Helsinki. So clearly there's some momentum there. And the campaigning was disseminated besides X in YouTube channels, branding themselves as alternative media, and I followed them all. I'm the PI. I have the responsibility towards my younger scholars and co-workers. And it was here where the lessons learned a few years back from that thesis became so useful. It no longer was just about the questioning scientific nature of gender studies or feminist theory in social sciences and humanities, which the pamphlet does in juxtaposing with that of the desirability of natural and engineering sciences. But our project was handpicked from the start because of our focus on date palm. Now, why is that? What do you think? It is because date palm, or rather date palm stomping or treading, is a code for racialized asylum seekers from Middle East and more generally anyone non-white. So how did we appear in X? What were the accusations? That we were Marxists because we used the concept commodity frontier And this, of course, only happened when we had made an intervention to say that commodity frontier is actually a widely accepted theoretical concept, which just is less popularized yet in Finnish as it is in English. That gender studies and feminist theorizing is BS. We have nothing concrete to offer than just jargonism. And that we were spending 5,000 euros to get to travel abroad. And I assume if this again was a code, it would be a code for sexual relationships with the date palm stompers, instead of paying nurses' salaries. And think of the irony of this coming from a representative of a party in government doing major cuts to health and social care. And I think it's actually intentional. Look at the picture. Was a way to mark our research team as one of our political ecologists is a Mexican living in Finland. And our international advisory team, which included a renovated South Asian feminist political economist at SOAS. So the whole internet, it seemed at that point, that it was not just about wasting Finnish taxpayers' monies, but also the British ones, which I really am quite touched with. And I just say last two words of that moment. Decide when the date palm started trending in right-wing in social media, I made an executive decision that it is time to start engaging, not directly, but with hardcore science and humor, and voila, Feminist Dates account was created, just roughly a week into the release of the pamphlet. And instead of getting into any arguments or effects, so turn the gender stereotype of women being emotional and men rational, here I'm just showing some of the English versions, and mind you, none of the enthusiasts follow these English ones, they follow the Finnish ones because there's the language politics involved. And our strategy was to focus on natural scientific knowledge of the gendered nature of date, which is it's a binary gender, but hermaphroditism actually is a major way that the small farmers that I do work with, they are revolutionizing the variety development. So we wanted to kind of like emphasize the fact that yes, we should be talking about gender, but we should be talking about the gender of the date palm trees. It was therapeutic, but also scientifically useful, because we may have not come up with the idea of riding the revolution in the making using hermaphrodite trees by small farmers with genetic scholars from India, Morocco, and Arab Emirates, with whom we had met just a couple of months earlier at Date Palm Conference. What made a difference, though, we had maybe 16 followers at that time, was that I asked a Finnish international relations professor with over 20,000 followers in X to repost some of our postings. And it's interesting, it created a dialogue. We got positive responses and the targeting actually died out in a week. But I'm not sure it actually was because of any of that, what we did. But it was also that M, after a couple of weeks, had moved on to target other funding mechanisms. And I'm predicting that we will get this annual ritual that we will be targeted again next autumn. Now, conclude. If 10 to 15 years ago, engagement with these topics was possible along with the research process openly in social media, or events like this event that are recorded and published afterwards, in 2026, such spaces or the demand to provide analysis in the middle of the research project publicly, how disaster populism works, let's say in India and so on, can potentially make the research process impossible. And it threatens the possibility of reaching the aims of the research and publish academically. There are also important aspects to consider of the racial threats to non-white researchers in Finland and partnering countries. So being sandwiched or crammed means being alert on multiple fronts simultaneously and thinking of ways to protect one's research integrity. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mariana, and thank all of you for not only providing such a good starting point for our panel discussion on how to do proper research in troubling times, but also for delivering so perfectly on expectations of Nordic punctuality. So we're perfectly in time. And we'll have a let's say 15-20 minute panel discussion and then open up for questions from the audience. So I'd like to invite all of you to join me here. And I'm a historian, so let me begin that way, because who would have thought 10 or 15 or 20 years ago that we would be sitting here having this kind of a discussion? So I'm a little curious to hear your thoughts on when did this madness begin? I mean, when did it start to affect maybe your work? As a historian, I try to place myself in that comfortable position somewhere from a bird's eye perspective and try to, see the deep historical forces going on. But in your own time, it's hard to get to really zoom in on those forces and what they really are. So it's perfectly fine during the course of this discussion to share your emotions and frustrations also, because it's part of our daily lives as scholars. So when did the madness begin and how has it affected you? From a very concrete point of view, I imagine that the geopolitical pressures of our times are affecting you somehow, at least in terms of your international collaboration. That's something I think we all are starting to feel. And maybe we can start with Mariana, who works on topics that are geopolitically vulnerable, perhaps.
Thank you. So I have to think of the different, like I was trying to kind of also show that it's, for me, having had research focus not on Finland per se, but to countries where populist politics has been much longer around. So I'd say in Indonesia, I mean, I hadn't even started doing research, but I'd say the kind of political processes that were part of the Achenese the struggle for independence included politicization of religion, and political Islam basically became one of the solutions by some of the politicians to see that it would reach to a state where people of Aceh would approve the peace process. So I'd say for scholars who I've become colleagues with later, after the 2004 tsunami, I mean, it was already there. So that whole contestation of Islam, gender politics, sexuality politics was already there. Now that seemed, at that point when I started doing that research, I realized I really have to start understanding what it means. Nobody here was talking about, I felt like I'm alone, because no one was at that point following maybe such context in my close circles that would understand what does this kind of disaster politics, what does it really mean to us in terms of designing our research projects and so on. But like I mentioned in my presentation, it really was 2015 and that whole asylum seeking crisis. I mean, that's where it really became kind of like visible in terms of, and to many other scholars apart from me, much more in vivid ways. I don't think I got the very, very aggressive part, but it was like just this feeling that something is cooking and happening.
Interesting, and we can get back to this, I mean, sharing our different perspectives from different geographical areas as well, if there's a blueprint here and or not. How does it look from your perspective, Susanna?
I think it's always been crazy. I mean, critical sexuality studies, it's always been in a difficult position because it's been connected to studies and discussions on sexual rights, on sexual equality, and diversity. So there's always been kind of critical pushback towards people who, for example, don't like the idea of gay rights. But porn studies, I mean, as a kind of a subfield, that's a particular kind of worms, because the debates have been so polarized, and the anti-porn lobby has been so strong, both the anti-porn feminist lobby, and then the broader, that's become kind of unholy alliance with the Christian right since the 80s. And this has sort of multiple meanings, that people do get attacked by their colleagues in the universities for studying porn, independent of really how they study it, unless it's a kind of with this kind of abolitionist agenda. But I mean, the whole madness, it's sort of grown, of course, with social media and the kind of the echo kind of capacities of that. But it's always been an uneasy terrain.
Universally, or more so in different places?
It's particularly tricky it's been tricky in US, UK and Australia. But then if you think of the kind of stakes of research, those have also been the hubs. Now, I was kind of naive as a postdoc. I did a talk at CUNY Graduate Center, and I was sort of like, yeah, I'll just talk about my research. And people were really upset because they wanted to talk about how porn is destroying American families. And I'm like, I'm not here to talk about American families. I'm here to talk about porn. I was not very well received. But I mean, I was naive in the sense that I thought that these debates, happened in the 80s and we sort of got over them, but they never went away. And what we've been seeing in Sweden in particular is this, in the last less than 10 years, really strong rise in anti-porn feminism. Yeah. So the porn debate in a way is closed. We know it's bad, and that's it. And this is dangerous in a situation when the kind of shapes and forms of sexual media are really ubiquitous. With smartphones, there's a lot of stuff going on, and if we can't study this from a kind of anti-normative perspective, I don't think it's good for young people. I don't think it's good for families. I don't think it's good for anyone. Yeah.
What about from the perspective of law and inclusion? And
yeah, so I think, well, it's difficult to say, I think, looking at from the outside, but I was thinking about also when I did my PhD in the 2010s, and this is, I think, I would say that this is maybe before the big rise of the far and radical right. In a sense, that's how I think back about it. But already then also, and I think that this also maybe resonates with what you were saying, that this is not just something of the Trump administration or of recent, there was always this kind of saying, and we were told also by older professors, that law and gender is not really a serious discipline. If you want to be a serious legal scholar, you should get into like a hard discipline like criminal law, or you should identify with this kind of more accepted disciplines. And there was the talk of the gender ghetto also. And I think there has also been some, for example, Hilary Charlesworth and some other scholars have also written about this when they went to these international law conferences, and it's called something like Talking to Ourselves, when they were all the people who all the scholars who did something related to gender just gathered in one corner and started discussing with each other about these topics, because they were not really taken seriously or so, but they found this kind of community and this kind of safe space. And I think that I also found that kind of safe space during the PhD, and also finding this kind of connections with other law and gender scholars, but then maybe also with more visibility, of course, the age of the internet, social media, also with these movements gaining traction and gaining power. And I think that I myself have started seeing this more, well, the recent decade maybe, and this kind of specific targeting, and also what you were mentioning, this unholy alliance really between far-right and Christian evangelical movements, feminist movements, often targeting, well, in your case, porn studies or sex studies, but also like trans rights is one big topic there that I think, the last decade maybe has really become more outspoken. And yes, the kind of attacks you see on social media, not just to myself, but also colleagues and what you heard. Of course, this leads to people maybe taking a more careful approach, not being so much on social media, withdrawing from different social media platforms.
Which leads me to my following question. Actually, one of you touched upon this in your talks. I forget who it was, but to what extent do you actually feel that censorship is becoming a problem? You also mentioned that we in the Nordic countries are experiencing these turbulences with a certain delay, luckily for us. But it is affecting us to some extent or not. Do you think censorship is a problem in your field or self-censorship? Susanna?
I think self-censorship, and it also depends on career stage. Like the stakes are very different for a junior scholar without a permanent position. I mean, stakes are pretty low for me. So the pyramid scheme of academia, in a way, it's sort of there's protection to some of us, but for those of us,
you feel safe. You know.
Well, I mean, I don't feel particularly vulnerable. I mean, I have been attacked in many ways for my research. I just don't care. I don't engage. I don't care. I stopped using X because of not because of the. I mean, some of those same militants probably that targeted you were sort of after me for a while, but because I was running this strategic research council project on intimacy in data-driven culture. And the intimacy word was too much, and there was a bit of a pushback. But I mean, I just didn't engage. But what I've been talking with my colleagues in literary studies, and it seems like in the US in particular, like a Finnish scholar, just recently had one book chapter rejected after it had gone through a process of 3 years, because it was an intersectional theory, and you can't have a literary theory with intersectional feminist theory because that's not theory. So a bit of a move back. The other article that was kind of critical of the politics of the Trump administration in a very soft way was also rejected on that basis after successful peer review process. Because we are networked in how we publish, in how we do research, so there's kind of resonances happen that can be very different, but they hit us in very, very different ways. Yeah.
Is censorship something you have felt?
Well, the interesting thing here is now that I was listening to fellow panelists talk was that I'd say amongst colleagues, there's much more censorship towards the academia, trying to survive kind of like masculinist, especially within international relations. So being a feminist international relations scholar is not in any way positive thing so far. So I can absolutely see, for example, when I was applying for my current job, Tampere Peace Research Institute has feminist peace research as in its strategic vision or strategic goal. So for the first time in my entire life, I could actually lay out my expertise without thinking, do I have to take out the feminist word here? So, I mean, that tells something about that environment. And sometimes when Double M was doing the campaigning in X, I was thinking, like, has he actually spoken to some of the IR professors? Because similar you would get that kind of critique when you apply for positions that gender, Jauhola is doing gender, this is not international relations. So it's kind of like thinking like, wow, there's some like interesting connections actually within academia to that type of thinking, which is out there now in X. I'm not sure, I mean, in terms of when it comes to my engagement with my research outside of Finland, I would not call it self-censorship, but I'm aware that well, you may want to call it self-censorship, but it's just being streetwise, that you don't go and send a research proposal to a government saying that I'm digging into the like ethno-nationalist ideology here. I mean, that's just, it's a no-go. I mean, you don't get the research visa with that. But it appears that there are also these other red flags. So even doing research with small farmers is now considered. So that's like, yeah, I refuse also to consider it necessarily as censorship, because if we want to study, the IR scholars mostly would be studying from staying in Helsinki and saying how the politics around the world is going. I mean, that's possible. But I, as an ethnographer, I actually need to talk to people. So I have to think of ways, how do I reach out and talk to people? And sometimes there are different strategies you have to play in order to get that access. But of course, it's a different matter then to report about this and talk about this, that, hey, this is actually happening. My scholarship is way more harder than if I would sit in the armchair and think what's happening in geopolitics. So it's really tricky. And I do recognize that there's a self-censorship point into that, but there's also that fact that you have to think long enough. Like maybe in 7 years' time, I'll get to publish what I actually wanted with the people in order to do intimate analysis, say, for example, how a certain political ideology plays it out in sustainable agricultural practice. Now, I cannot do that if I don't get access to those farmers, for example. So yeah, it's a tricky thing.
So returning to the question of regional differences and degrees of turbulence and Nordicness, I mean, we are here at the Finnish Academy of Science and Letters, and the event is hosted by the Holberg Prize Committee in Bergen, so we have a Nordic connection here. And I suggested in my introduction that if we have a Nordic university model that has been somehow successful, it's also tied to the welfare state model and the ideals of social egalitarianism and regional development, and all of that was part of that model, and securing equal possibilities for researchers across the board. But then again, when was the Nordic welfare state, and what was the Nordic welfare state, and to what extent does it affect the academic sphere? The Norwegian sociologist Lars Mjøseth once said that the Nordic welfare state existed between 1973 and 1975, and we like to remember it as this. So you know what I mean. Is it a reality or an illusion? Do you feel that this model of public-funded universities that are fairly robust still can serve as a safeguard against political and economic pressures? I mean, we still have a relatively egalitarian and tuition-free university in our countries. On the other hand, they're also highly competitive and increasingly international stratified institutions. So how do you feel fortunate to be in scholars working in the Nordic region, or would it be as good anywhere else? To put it very simply.
Can I start? Because I would also
Yes.
like to go back to your previous question and then come back to this one if possible, because I think also on the kind of Nordic academic context and also self-censorship there, I have also a very practical example of how self-censorship can work. I was involved in a Strategic Research Council funded project about integration and migration recently, some years ago, and for those who are not familiar with how this Strategic Research Council funding works, so it's strategic research in the sense that it's not just scientific impact, but it's supposed to have a societal impact, and it's also then works that there is normally, I think, one period of funding. In that case, it was 3 years, and then you can apply to get another 3 years of funding. And we had a change of government also. Before we had to apply for more funding on this project on migration and integration. And while the previous government had been quite, in a way, hands-off in terms of what researchers in the Strategic Research Council funded projects were doing, the current government clearly imposed a criteria for getting additional funding, the project had to be clearly connected to the government program. And in a project on migration and integration, that was also quite difficult in many ways. Sort of what do we find in there, and sort of how do we navigate this field? And I think that in the Nordic context, now coming back to your second question, I think that there is this, or there has been recently, this reliance on governments or the good state, and governments being maybe social democratic or not necessarily engaging in this way in research during the last decade. So I think we don't necessarily have the blueprint for how to negotiate or how to navigate these situations. That we find ourselves in this kind of new position where we have to think, do we self-censor or do we push back? Do we try to get our institutions on board? Do we write some public letter? It's kind of a new situation in this sort of immediate political, historical context, I think. And then is there a safeguard, or the Nordic publicly funded universities a safeguard against what we are seeing going on in the world? Well, I think, of course, that publicly funded education is, and public institutions, public scholarship, that it's very important. And I don't think that introducing tuition fees, which I think in many Nordic countries, certainly in the Finnish context, has become more and more discussed. And of course, tuition fees are already in place for non-EU, EEA, Swiss citizens in several Nordic countries. I don't think that that's some safeguard that will make the universities more democratic or more immune to attacks also from, probably will lead to the universities becoming more elitist and being seen as more elitist as well.
Yeah, but just say, because the Strategic Research Council money, basically, it was just for non-Finnish participants. It was basically, the money was taken out from basic research, allocated by the Finnish Research Council to this pocket, to programs to aid in political decision-making. So it's about societal problems or challenges that we need more research on. It sounds good, but in practice, there's the problem, and the politicians we worked with, because I was PI of a project for 6 years, actually say, like, they are not interested unless they agree. And with the government, that is, certain parties in that government have quite strong anti-work agendas. It's kind of like interesting how can then work that actually respects equality, as we should according to Finnish legislation, how can we aid their political decision making? How does it work? It doesn't really work. But I would say the one thing, I absolutely would not want to work in a university with tuition fees, because it adds to it eats away at the kind of equalitarian principles. Like, I'm definitely the first in my family with a PhD. I may be first one with an MA. So I'm still of that sort of generation where education isn't basically inherited, in a family line where everyone has a PhD. But also in terms of academic freedom, when there are no tuition fees, doing research on so-called risky topics doesn't make you reputational liability for the institution. And I think one of the reasons why we don't have that many senior academics, let's say in the US, working on sexual media over the years, is that they are perceived as a reputational liability, because the parents of the students, they don't want their money to go into that kind of smut. They don't want their children to be impacted, and there's a really strong lobbying that happens. Whereas in the Finnish system, it's not really about the topics that you study. it's more like the output and the quality of the output that matters traditionally. That doesn't mean that everyone is happy with sort of controversial topics, but that unhappiness doesn't really have the same effect, the kind of muting effect.
I think at this point, because we have people in the audience that deal with topics related to science, policy, and politics on a daily basis, so I think we should bring in the audience, if that's okay for you, and maybe please raise your hand if you have a question you would like to raise. Maybe also present yourself.
Yeah, is it on? Yes. Elina Vuola, I'm the professor of global Christianity at the Faculty of Theology here at the University of Helsinki, and a former Nils Klim committee member. You know, I was interviewed a few years ago to 2 books in Finland, which looked, one of them has been published, which look at the early days of gender studies in Finland. One is called Naistutkimuksen alkuja, and the other one is still, it's focusing on the study of religion. So your issues, actually, what you talked about, and especially what Daniela and Mariana raised, is that it's in many ways I'm of that generation of gender studies and combining religion, both. You know, like, we don't combine those. But, you know, I have this experience, and reading this book that already came out, independently of what field we are from, people of my generation who made it in the university, we tell the same story. Ridicule, telling, I'm sorry to hear that even in your generation, you know, too narrow, too political. Yeah. So it has been, and it still is, also an issue of universities themselves. So I'm not belittling at all the threat that we are facing from outside, but universities are human spaces, hierarchical spaces. So I think that is one thing also that would be very important to talk about, that we are able to be self-critical also. Yeah. And I think fields like religion, theology, philosophy, international studies, law, very male-dominated in many ways still today. And by that I don't necessarily mean like how many men and how many women there are, but you know about that censorship to research comes also from within the universities, and young scholars are especially vulnerable to that. You know, hear things like that. That's like what you said. It makes me really angry to hear that you still. Maybe they want your best, but it's still. So and I think that's it's wonderful to see 3 gender scholars to talk about these issues, because we also know about this since our very early days in research.
Let's take 2 questions at a time. There's one at the back here. Last row. Yeah.
Thank you, Andreas Vellestal from the University of Oslo and the Klim committee. These are fascinating presentations, not very hopeful. And I mean, you've laid out both the symptoms and the prognosis that seem very, very bad. Before your presentations, we started an interesting conversation outside discussing, so what could be done? And if there's time now or later, I mean, also for the community here, what might we as scholars do? And we have tried ad nauseam, perhaps too many males, coming up with all the facts and the deductions and the arguments. It seems clear we also need to speak to people's hearts. We also need to somehow engage with the perceived challenges and the worries of the rank and file populists, and perhaps give up on the militant central leaders, because we can speak up and down about the plausible causes of populism, somehow nostalgia for a time that never was, for the economic inequality that is caused by lots of other factors than immigration and so on. But your experiences, when have you succeeded, do you think, and when could we succeed together in somehow turning the tide a little by little?
Very good questions. Who would like to start?
Well,
Yes, Mariana.
I maybe. Thank you both. Yeah, I think there's a lot intergenerational learning that probably, and this kind of like connecting and solidarity that can appear out of speaking out of the experience, and I actually just wanted to like say that in the academic communities where I've been mostly active the past 15 years, which is global development studies and peace research, I'd say I can't say of the all Nordics, but I just say that in the Finnish context, that whatever university system we have, it's embedded in whiteness. I mean, I'm in such disciplines right now where it really is changing, and changing very fast. But when you look at the nominations for professorships and so on, it still keeps on being very, very white. So I think my colleagues, before I get into the hope part, my colleagues are dealing with MICRI, my colleagues are dealing with resident permits, my colleagues are talking about the everyday racism that they face within the streets. I mean, literally, I've been told how people are being attacked at tram stops and things like that. So there's a long way for that ideal Nordic university in my case when I look at what's happening. In terms of what could be done, I mean, what I've done, tried with the previous research in particular, because there was a wonderful scholarship that we got from the Finnish Cultural Foundation to do documentary films. So what was videos? I mean, film sounds so grandiose, but I took them to streets. So where the peace process was brokered, I literally did pop up video screenings for anyone. I went to schools, tried to talk about, so like literally talking that people who wouldn't come to events like this, trying to like really make it at the personal level of engagement, of talking, that we can talk about complexity without actually having to become very, very binaristic and polarizing. So that was a quite great exposure to where to go as a scholar. We don't get rewarded by that, by the way. When it comes to applying for professorships and so on, what matters is the publication. So the public engagement is not actually really, at the end of the day, it's not what qualifies you as a professor. So there's a lot to do in that regard.
Yeah, I would say, I mean, I was a grad student in the gender system graduate school, so the National Gender Studies graduate program, and I was in the second round. So certain battles had been fought and just in won, and I don't think I would have been able to sort of do the things I've been doing without that kind of level of support. And what I've been doing recently, I mean, my sort of hope, which, I mean, this sounds, it's a bit of a cliche, but young people, I mean, seriously, because I've been involved with the Association for Internet Researchers since year 2000, since it started. And what I've seen is like approaches and interests that were completely marginal. Like we would have a birds of a feather group for feminist, queer and post-colonial research, and we would be like 12 people in a conference of hundreds of people, whereas it really we wouldn't fit in a small seminar room these days. So things have changed, and this is not because of senior people, it's because of younger scholars. So in a way, because I had support, especially from feminist researchers as a junior scholar, so I've been trying to give back. So I've become something of a European porno auntie. meaning that there's a steady, and I'm kind of happy with that. So there's a steady kind of rotation of last year PhD students. I've had a couple from Brazil, a couple from Italy. There's a Swiss student right now. There's one coming from Belgium in the spring, who basically come to do the last stretches of the PhD work and get feedback. And then that's also how networks are built. And I think for me, the hope comes from these kind of networked connections and being actually able to provide not like substantial support, but substance support, at least for junior scholars, so that they wouldn't be so isolated, because I know how important that was for me as a younger person. Yeah.
Would you also want to comment?
Yes, thank you. I mean, I agree with many of the points that you have raised, and thank you also for the excellent questions. I was talking about regarding the first question. I was talking to also a law and gender colleague who was one of the first sort of law and gender scholars in Finland, Kevät Nousiainen, who was also discussing this, how universities in Finland have become more precarious and affected more by this kind of new public management and this kind of trends, on the same time as gender scholars and more women scholars have entered academia. And these have sort of gone hand in hand. And I think that there's definitely more to say about that. But then how to turn the tide? Yes. That is a big question, a difficult question. I agree with my colleagues that public engagement is important, and I think that the kind of examples that you gave are important, where we as scholars listen to what the public is saying, what people are saying. Public engagement is not just where we go out and say, this is how it is, and lecturing, because I think that many aspects of, or many parts of societies are probably quite tired of that. They don't want to be lectured, and we should also listen. It's important that we listen to what is going on. But also in public scholarship, I think today we are struggling with finding the public, because the public, where are the public spaces these days? People tend to be very isolated and within their own, sort of following their own channels, and we are struggling also to find this sort of common space. So I think that is definitely a task that we have to be engaged with, to maintain a public and maybe widen the public, and to be able to participate in that. And that is a huge task. And it's about finding allies and finding others who are interested, and also accepting that, we don't always agree on everything, but that's okay. As long as, there are, important values that we should protect.
Thank you very much. We're running out of time, so at this point I want to thank you all for the discussion. I definitely don't want to leave us with a sense of despair, so I thank especially the last question. We are looking forward. Consider this a first step, diagnosis. It's always important to know what constrains your freedom, so to speak. So that's the beginning, and this is what we've been discussing. Susanna, you mentioned Plato and Trump in your talk, and we already know from Plato's Republic what happens when you hand over political power to the world of commerce and deal making. So here we are, but we have identified some important tasks ahead, and perhaps we'll get back to those in a subsequent discussion. And thank you all for the attentive audience and for the good questions. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.